it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsi.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two ever bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them pension. I can't. There's a good friends of mine out there fucking say. Well, he's divorced, you have to do his something. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the the boss is your boss.
And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to wrap up this show this week with part, 7 or some shit of the Philadelphia mob history. And we're going to jump right into it. So 2 weeks back, we talked about the rise of Joe Ida and how prior to Appalachian, Ida kept himself very well insulated. So much so that the feds who were looking into the Philadelphia Mafia believed that Marco Reginelli was the boss at the time. And what is perhaps interesting is that in those days, bosses tried to insulate themselves from peering eyes, but none of them were completely successful in that way. And eventually, any insulation that they had would be exposed by an event, a crime, or the newspapers. And that would be no different for Joe Ida. Even if he had Marco Reginelli out front and center, all it really truly took was the infamous 1957 mob meeting in upstate New York that we know to be the Appalachian meeting to expose Ida, but not in the way that you might expect. Sure, Ida took a beating in terms of the press, who began their assault on the businessmen. However, the one thing that Ida had that others before him truly didn't have was power. The government wanted all the info on Joe Ida leaked publicly. They wanted to force others to talk. But the one thing that the federal government did not expect was for local law enforcement to protect Joe Ida at all cost. And if you look throughout history of Cosa Nostra, you would be hard-pressed to find another mob boss who was given that sort of indifference. Maybe Capone in some portions of Chicago was given that indifference for a short period of time. And what makes this altogether more surprising is because the small territory that Philadelphia actually has, or actually is. And the point I want to make to all of you who may not understand Philadelphia is a couple of things. Number one, everybody knows everything that's going on in Philadelphia. They always have. It's the biggest gossip-mongering community I've ever been around in my life. Sit around long enough and people will discuss murders and mayhem and everything in between. And what makes Philadelphia powerful is that nobody talks even if they know. Sure, they may have, they may talk and gossip at bars. They may engage in full-out gossiping. And they may know the facts about murders and other things, but it stays right there. And I've always said, if the FBI truly wanted to eradicate the mafia in Philadelphia, just put agents in the bars. That's how easy it would be. Now with Joe Ida, the local law enforcement, as I said, refused to help the federal government at all. They refused to budge for them. So while the papers, just after Appalachian, tried to frame Ida as a mob boss, something strange happened. The press, likely coerced by federal law enforcement and attorneys, began a new reporting style. And that was to frame the government as witch hunters who were bothering, simple businessmen. Not all, but the most distinguished journalists at the time who were taken seriously began to mock the government and local prosecutors. And nobody did a better job at that than a guy by the name of Reggie Kavanaugh, who scoffed publicly at the prosecution and government and considered their investigation into Joe Ida silly and without any kind of merit. No other mob boss had the ability to sway journalists like Joe Ida. And I think that's because of his demeanor and because he stayed out of the limelight. And we've said before, there is risk and reward for staying out of sight. Sadly, everybody after Angelo Bruno never understood that. So when the prosecutors posted Joe Ida's photos trying to lay that mob moniker at his feet, reporters scoffed at the prosecution's attempts. And what is even more astonishing is that nobody came forward to utter a negative word about Ida. A simple information drop that Ida was a hitman for Joe Bruno would have been catastrophic for Joe Ida, but yet nobody ever bothered to mention a word about that. And when I say that nobody mentioned a word, I mean legitimately nobody of consequence, which only furthered the agitation of the feds and the prosecutors, who then launched an all-out investigation into Joe Ida, which would now include informants and people within his own family. Albany, New York, Newark, and Philadelphia law enforcement at the federal level all began to work together. Agents would report a meeting in upstate New York, i.e. Appalachian, which was a business meeting of the Mafia where they would discuss the financial affairs of the mob and discuss many money-making businesses that they had and other business ventures that they wanted to get involved in, i.e. narcotics. And for what it's worth, Salvatore Sabella knew damn well that this meeting, he knew what it was going to be about, and that's why he refused to go. Sabella would remark to somebody decades later that narcotics was the business, and he knew having everybody sitting in one spot discussing that was too risky. But at the same time, there was also internal issues going on down in Philadelphia, and one informant would explain to FBI agents that Dominic Oliveto, who once carried weight, no longer had any weight after the Appalachian events. The same informant explained that after Appalachian, there was another meeting 3 weeks later down in Miami, in which Skinny Razor attended, and that he was Philadelphia's representative at that meeting. For Ida, the Appalachian meeting was a problem, and it was really bad for him publicly. He couldn't recover from the public scrutiny, and now, even with the help of local cops and the newspapers, he knew that his clock was beginning to run out of time. If Ida is never found at that meeting, he probably controls Philadelphia to the end of his life. However, with his name out there, the government began to turn up evidence, and they began to get more information about Ida from informants, and they began to surveil him nonstop. And all that information just led from one source to another source, and someone who Ida loved like a son told the feds everything from where Ida did business and where he hid out and where he kept his money and everything in between. And as a result of that, the U.S. Treasury Department opens a file on Ida. And with the meddling, with all of the surveillance and the internal issues that are brewing in Philadelphia, Ida becomes a nervous wreck. So in the snowy winter of 1958, while Ida is trying to figure out what to do, the Mafia in Philadelphia was in revolt. The feds had arrested Casella, and it just seemed like the hierarchy was going down left and right. Riccobene, Reginelli, Oliveto, Ida, and now Joe Regnetta made some enemies within Philadelphia. Regnetta had been up to underboss, but it didn't last because there was too much friction on the streets. At the time, the usual suspects were weighing options and dealing with friction. One guy who was likely taking advantage of all of that was Angelo Bruno, who was just at the time stockpiling money. Bruno, who had a close relationship with Carlo Gambino, was sending money back to New York on his own, and it made him look good to gangsters back in New York. And this is Bruno's way of jockeying for a position without making an outward gesture. Whatever Bruno thought didn't really matter because Joe Ida was still the boss. And with all the heat and the inner turmoil that was developing in South Philly, Ida hops on a steamliner and he heads back to Italy for a month. Ida doesn't take his wife with him. He leaves her behind. And prior to leaving, he hands $400 to a member of the crime family in $20 bills, which were dated, frayed, and sort of dirty, but they went back to 1934. And the money looked like it had been buried in the ground. And that info came from the soldier in the family who had gone bad and was providing information to the feds. Later in 1958, Joe Ida gets indicted. The problem was, Ida had told the arresting officers back at Appalachian that he didn't know who Vito Genovese was, even though they were in the car together. And he also told them, well, let me put it this way. He told them, I don't know who Vito was, that he was just riding next to me in the car when we got pulled over at the property of Joe Barbara. Vito, well, okay. So he gives them a line about he was a car salesman, and he didn't know Vito was just giving the guy a ride, right? Well, this gets seriously fucking bad. Vito tells the New York Crime Probe that Joe Ida invited him to go with him to upstate New York, which completely contradicted what Joe Ida had told them. Genovese also adds that Ida was inside of Joe Barbara's home for a long time, which also refutes what Ida had said, because Ida told them he didn't go inside the home. And this was seen to others as a rat move by Genovese to save his own skin, trying to bury Ida. And he also told them that Joe Ida was in the mob, and he was the boss of Philadelphia. So let me sort of capture this. They pull into the estate, or they're pulling out of the estate. The cops jump on the car. They pull everybody out. They put them on different sides, and they start talking. Ida tells one story. Genovese tells another story. Okay? Okay, that's fine. Everybody's telling different stories. But after all of that, Genovese pulls a cop aside and tells him, he's basically the boss of the Philadelphia mob and he was inside there for a long time. That's a fucking rat move. And he did it to save his own skin. Listen, maybe the two should have formed an alibi together. That probably would have been the smarter move. But Genovese was trying to save his own ass. And by telling investigators what he did, gets him off the hook. And it ends up getting Joe Ida indicted. Is that ratting? Yes, it is 100%. But I'm also going to add to that Ida didn't suffer because of Genovese's words in the end. But it didn't help at all. And many in mob circles were irate that Vito Genovese did that. Because the majority of guys clammed the fuck up and didn't say a word. Not Vito. He opened up his mouth and just let it flow. Save his own skin. And so by 1959, Ida sees the writing on the wall. Any ideas that he might have had escaping the feds was starting to wear on him. All the front bosses, all the help from local cops, the newspapers, and prosecutors, it was waning. For years, Ida had Middlesex County District Attorney and his son, also an attorney, the Willenses, in his pockets. They enabled Ida to skate charges. They were able to keep prosecutors at bay. And Ida knew that all the bridges that he had built, all the politicians that he had become friends with, all the bribes to local law enforcement couldn't help him anymore. He knew he couldn't bribe a federal agent to back down, and he knew he couldn't ask the Willenses to help anymore either, as rumors began to surface that they were on the take. And this was no doubt unleashed on the public by J. Edgar Hoover. Whether it's totally accurate or not, Hoover was ensuring that the heat would kill the relationship if there was an actual beneficial relationship going on. And that's exactly what it did. And this is why Ida takes off to Italy. It also enables him to send a letter to prosecutors saying that he was too ill to travel back to the United States to face charges. He was running from those charges. And to the guys back in Philadelphia, it looked weak. And the government knew he was full of shit. And back in Italy, Ida begins to try and change his image by giving money to the poor, donating money to churches, and he was doing all he could to make his image look squeaky clean. And the government here didn't buy it. And what they do is they send reporters from the Associated Press to go to Italy to interview Ida. And to their shock, when they arrive, they find him. And what is he doing? He's hunting, has a great tan, and looked to be perfectly happy and fine. Back in Philadelphia, Joe Ida's wife would keep in communication with him and would explain that he needed to come back and face the charges, proving to prosecutors that they were totally wrong about who he was. And after a while, the government gets fed up and they bar Ida from re-entering the United States. And Ida would try to use, I want to reunite with my wife, as an excuse to come back, but the government wouldn't let him. And they could play the game too as good as anybody else. And legally, they had him by the balls because in 1890, his 1890 registration back in Italy, in the near side margin to the left-hand side, he renounced his U.S. citizenship in 1960. And because of that, the government legally could keep him the fuck out of the United States. Eventually, Ida would write in a letter pleading with the government to allow him back in, otherwise he was going to kill himself. And of course, the government releases that to mob guys on the streets. Joe's wife keeps sending him money, and the letters back and forth the government would actually intercept and read. And as a result of Joe Valachi and Bobby Kennedy's witch hunting, the FBI continued to monitor every single move that Joe Ida made in Italy. And with Ida stuck in that country, the news just got worse and worse because the government was acknowledging that the Mafia existed, and hearing after hearing was being held. And the FBI had bolstered its information and had a log line of Philadelphia's mob history from informants. Informants began to come forward, and it was the beginning of the end of the golden age of organized crime in the United States. Philadelphia always wanted regime change, and the FBI was fully aware of that, especially as the result of the informants. So in September of 1958, Domenico Pollina gets elected the new boss, unseating Joe Rugnetta. And the problem for Pollina, though, was that he was a big mouth, and he never seemed to understand his role in the Mafia and had little input as far as how the commission delegated their business. He thought he had the right to speak however he wanted to the commission, and he was dead wrong. He just rubbed the commission bosses the wrong way back in New York. And by the time Pollina took over, Ida was a forgotten man. At that point, nobody in the mob recognized him, nor did anybody seem to recognize Ida or that he ever existed. And a lot of that was because they considered Ida a coward, running away from charges, then threatening to kill himself. And it makes him look incredibly soft, which is likely why Genovese talking about him to the investigators was bypassed. However, had Genovese not said what he said, basically admitting Ida was in the Mafia and a boss, it came back to haunt Ida. And it was in 1963 when Joe Valachi drops the bomb that Ida was the boss in Philadelphia. So now they had Vito Genovese who told them, and now they have Valachi. And Ida saw that as a betrayal from within. From Genovese, now Valachi. Ida felt disrespected and stabbed in the back. And in those early days, this would have never happened. Men would have gone to war for him, protected him, done whatever to help rub politicians the right way to get him out of a jam. And what was once all for one for all, became all for me. All for me. And Ida was fed up. But what Ida didn't realize was his departure from the United States opened the door for Angelo Bruno. Bruno was also slick to the extent that he did his best to insulate himself from the narcotics rackets. He was involved, but not to the point where they could prove it. And what helps Angelo Bruno in these days is the fact that the feds knew his main source of income was gambling. And with narcotics becoming the main protagonist with the feds, they would ignore the shit that Angelo Bruno was doing in favor of guys like Casella, who are moving a ton of weight. What also helps Angelo Bruno was the fact that Joe Ida refused to step in when Harry Riccobene was facing a stiff sentence for narcotics. The fact that Ida refused to help Casella or Riccobene allows Bruno to absorb their gambling rackets without there being a street beef. It also allows Bruno to position himself to rise to the top with any sort of interference. So with Joe Ida gone, Philadelphia begins to grow. New associates, new made men, new soldiers. And Philadelphia was growing, and the government loved it because now they had something to actually watch, whereas before it was really hit or miss. Most of the time they missed. Hoover ensured that Philadelphia would be watched closer, and they employed Italian federal agents and sent them to Philadelphia. Wiretaps began to be used, and the feds brought in translators to decipher Sicilian dialects. The problem for Philadelphia was there was really no real hierarchy, no real boss, and everybody was basically doing whatever the fuck they wanted. There was no oversight. Anybody who had power was basically in prison. For Ida, back in Italy, he just went about his life. He hunted, he took care of himself, and by 1971, the government closed his file. But decades later, they had one last entry. And that last entry was Ida was dead at 94 in Italy. Ida, while, did many new things, is in terms of organized crime, he fell to the same trappings as those before him. He had formed a new family, which was more open to the ideals similar to Lucky Luciano. He had insulated himself to the point where he reduced the fear and the power he had by being a ghost. While being a ghost would serve others like Toto Rina, Bernardo Provenzano, Carlo Gambino, and Frank Cali. Those guys were able to sustain power through fear and sheer loyalty. But Ida, by being unseen, created instability within the ranks. And then you add all the soft shit that goes with it. In 1959, Antonio, Mr. Miggs, Pollina was in trouble. In the fall of 58, Pollina was enjoying the rise in power he had in the Philadelphia mob. Pollina had been named boss, but just as quick received a message from the commission that he had to step down or they would kill him. And Pollina was an acting representative of Philadelphia on the commission, and never before had the commission ever told a sitting member to get lost. And this all stemmed from an issue with Angelo Bruno, which we are not going to discuss this week, but I think some of you already know what that is. So Antonio Pollina was born in Caccamo, Sicily in 1892. Little was known about his childhood, but at one time he was primed to become actually a priest. He would enter the seminary, but a lack of funds from his family forced him to drop out. And as a result, he goes to work as a laborer with his father. He would enter the Italian army at age 22, and he would make a name for himself in the military, would fight in World War I, and attain medals for bravery, and worked his way up in the military ranks. According to Pollina, his claim to fame was crawling on his stomach in a firefight as bullets were flying over his head to attach needed communication lines for the army. According to Pollina, in 1920, he was an inspector of agriculture overseeing 75 workers. What is actually known, though, is that Pollina becomes a made man in Sicily at some point, likely prior or during his position as the agriculture inspector. Pollina's brother Filippo, who was also a made guy, had left Sicily for Philadelphia in 1902, and it's likely that one of Pollina's sisters went with Filippo to Philadelphia at the same time, but we don't know for sure. So in 1917, when Filippo was trying to become a U.S. citizen, his brother Antonio was fighting in World War I. And when Filippo arrived, he would list his occupation as a cement finisher, which at the time was considered a skilled labor job, and he would settle around 5th and Washington. Filippo would open up a grocery store on 11th Street. Now, back in Italy, Benito Mussolini was pushing for new laws to eradicate the mafia, and one of these new laws was criminal association, making it against the law to even associate with someone who was a gangster or a criminal. Just knowing somebody or hanging out with them made you guilty. Caesar Mori would then have a campaign of rounding up any mafia-associated member. All you had to be was suspected, and you would be arrested. And those two things put the mafia back in Sicily into upheaval. Back in Sicily, lawyers, doctors, and politicians, or anybody who helped or was perceived to be helping a mob member, was subject to arrest. And it creates a huge problem for lawyers, especially because now it would be hard to defend them in a court of law, especially with the way the law was written into the country. And it caused a mass exodus of gangsters to come to the United States, which is how many of them, like Joe Bonanno, arrived in the United States. And this is also likely the reason why Antonio Pollina left. He saw what was coming and considering that he was a made guy in a Sicilian mob family, he opted to leave rather than face arrest or harassment. Pollina would head to Naples and then would jump on the SS Conte Russo, which would arrive in New York City on November 1st, 1923. He would head to Pittsburgh, which was a familiar mob enclave, and he would work in the wholesale grocery business, but eventually he would grow tired of it and he would head to South Philadelphia. And like a lot of the guys we talked about, he lived in Philadelphia but would work in rural New Jersey farms, picking vegetables and peaches and etc., but that grows tiresome, and it wasn't really financially sustainable, so to South Philly he starts to work. His brother Filippo was a member of the Sabella crime family back in Philadelphia, and the tradition was in those days that a boss back in Italy had to vouch for you via correspondence. But because Filippo was regarded as trustworthy, Sabella admits the transfer of Antonio into their crime family. And for a few years that Filippo had actually been in Philadelphia, he had gained a reputation from other gangsters, and he had seniority in that crime family. And with Filippo's respect, Anthony automatically got it as well. And so we're going to stop there. And the reason why, and I didn't mean to like completely rush through this, but the reason why we're going to stop here is because there's a lot of things that are going to happen in the next week. Pollina is about to make some serious friends, and he finds himself making more money than he ever dreamed of. And it's going to be the rise and fall of Pollina. But before we go, remember last week I said that I had something regarding Luciano that might answer a big question? Well, here we go. So over the years, people have always asked why Lucky Luciano never became a huge juggernaut back in Italy after he was deported, considering all of his connections. Well, it turns out in those early days, the Sicilian mob used Luciano just as he had used them. And when the money was coming in and the money was huge, everybody was in favor of Luciano. But also keep in mind that Luciano was the United States mob boss, not a Sicilian mob boss, okay? So the second that Luciano gets deported from the United States, Sicilian gangsters saw him as a nobody, somebody who was not like them. They viewed him as a punk, nothing more, nothing less. And Luciano had no standing in Italy whatsoever. Sicilians especially didn't like him. And even though Luciano had tried to live in Sicily when he first went back, the Sicilian mob threw him out, telling him, "You're not wanted here, leave." And the old world Sicilians did not trust him because he was Neapolitan. He's from Naples. And they made it well known to him he had no standing there. And this is really the reason why Luciano went back to Naples. This is why he left Sicily and went to Naples. And the problem in Naples was Luciano had tried to stoke those old gangster fires. But the Camorra wanted nothing to do with Luciano at all. And to them, he was an American boss with zero standing in Italy. And I'm sure there were some facets to Luciano being surveilled that bothered a lot of people as well, right? That can't help. But from the narcotics aspect, they didn't need Luciano anymore. They had already established new ties to other gangsters in the United States. And while Luciano initially tried to start up again in Italy, the mob there immediately put a stop to it. Like he may have been the capo di tutti capi in America, but in Italy he was a nobody. And this information came from informants in Italy and within the United States. And it also came from Philadelphia gangsters talking to the feds too. And this issue was an issue that apparently was brought up in Appalachian. And those who became informants would tell the FBI that Luciano had no more power when he left America. Once he left, it was over. And that any idea that Luciano had tried to reestablish drug routes or connections at the behest of the mob were a joke. Because Luciano essentially got chased from the mob, not just in Sicily, but also in Naples. And while Luciano had tried so hard to extinguish the old bigotry from the old country, and had done quite well in America, Sicily and Sicilians and native Neapolitans saw it as completely differently. And it's like we said weeks ago, bosses in America who attempted to use Western Sicilian values would fail. You couldn't teach it or expect others to employ it, which is exactly why men like Massaria and Maranzano had to go, and why men like Sabella saw the change as an end to the mafia. What works in America is American values and systems based on Sicilian and Neapolitan values, and it transferred differently. But back in the homeland, nothing changed. And that was the problem. Luciano had a lot of power and a lot of weight in this country. But when he went over there, it wasn't that way. Sure, they did in the early days when they're all making money together in the routes. But the minute he's no longer a boss and he's not in control, he's persona non grata. And there's a ton of evidence to suggest that based on the last couple of years of his life. He lived like a ghost. Wasn't really seen with anybody. And sure, a lot of that was surveillance and other things. But it just goes to show you, golden goose today, a heap of shit tomorrow. And that's just the way organized crime works. And so Saturday night, when we do our YouTube Live, we're going to get into this Joe Ida Genovese shit a little bit. And we're going to talk about Gambino and Bonanno, because the term rat, and I know I've talked about this a dozen times, but I really need to be clear on Saturday night about this. You cannot pick and choose the way you use that word. You cannot pick and choose the code for how you want it to be. Because oftentimes a lot of these knuckleheads on YouTube, they use it for guys they like and use it against guys they hate. But the reality is it's the same mechanism. It's the same mechanism. Telling on somebody to do them damage, and that's really what we're going to talk about, is yes, it's a time period thing. Gambino and all these guys were all telling on each other and doing underhanded shit. Absolutely. That was what they were doing in those days, but that's still rat shit. That's still shit. So we play this honor and this integrity fucking soap opera that we play when we talk about organized crime. There really isn't any of it. Because these guys all tell on each other. And I think the one thing that I learned, especially when we were doing the rat files, which Dean loves. I think that's Dean's favorite thing. If I just did 12 hours of rat files all day, he'd love it. But that's the one thing that I learned, was that this was so much deeper, so much broader than everybody ever knew. But yet we focus on Salvatore Gravano. He's the biggest rat ever. Really? I don't think he is. He's still a fucking rat. Don't get me wrong. He's a garbage pail. Harry Riccobene was a rat. He was giving up information on everybody. Just because it doesn't lead to prosecutions does not mean you're not fucking telling on people. And the guys that were able to provide information and keep themselves safe, and the FBI paid them and they didn't have to testify, those are the winners. Believe it or not, I hate to use that term because I don't think they're winners. I think they're fucking jerk-offs. Those are the guys that won. Because they get out of the life, they make their illegal money, they do this, they do that, and they never have to testify. But that's the problem. They still gave up information that led from A to B just because you talk and you use Genovese saying what he said about Ida, that gets Ida thrown out of this fucking country for the most part because he gets indicted, and then he can't come back in because of a legal loophole. But Genovese does that to get the prosecutors off his back. He's trying to save his own skin. Fuck Ida. Fuck Philadelphia. That's why he does it. Then you look at Carlo Gambino. He pays Nelson Cantaloupes to set up Vito Genovese to take a bad drug pinch, which Vito really didn't do. That's my point. Carlo's, it's okay that Carlo did that? It's not. Is it okay that Vito Genovese called the United States authorities on Lucky Luciano being in Cuba? No. It's the same shit. Is it right Joe Bonanno and his son giving all this information about organized crime for 2 decades? No. But yet people want to focus on the guys that testify. They're no different than Joey Massino. They're no different. It's because the government decided not to indict or not to prosecute. Except for in the case of Ida, they did. But if they had taken anything, well, look at the case of Carlo. Genovese does get indicted, arrested, and heads to prison for the rest of his fucking life because he dies behind the fucking wall. As a result of Carlo Gambino, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano setting that up. How is that any different than what Joey Massino did? It's not. It's the same mechanism. It's the same trait. And so I think that my perspective, and you'll hear more about this on Saturday, is they're either all rats or none of them are. You cannot pick and choose. And when people say to me, well, there's kind of a higher, Tom LaVecchia has always asked me, do you think there's a hierarchy to be an informant? I don't. It's the same impetus. It comes from the same place. Somebody who's trying to deflect from themselves to get somebody else in trouble so they don't go to jail. That's all this is. You can't bark about John Gotti sitting down with the feds and talking to them when half of these other guys did too. And I'm not defending what Gotti did. And I'm going to leave this as the final thought for the week. And it's a question that I asked at the beginning of the show. If John Gotti was the head of the commission, what happens to Joey Merlino? Do you think he accepts this? Do you think he accepts this? With all that, we'll see everybody Saturday night at 8:30. Don't miss it. Like I said, I'm going to try not to flip out. I'm going to try to keep it moving, but you never know. But we need to have a real discussion. Because for all of you people that continue to fucking say, oh, John Gotti with his fucking mouth, John Gotti being seen in public, you have an active mob boss on YouTube. Get fucking real. Now, why is that acceptable and what John did not? Because once again, it's who you like and who you don't like. And me, I call a spade, and I always have. And that's all there is to it.